This season of the Cold Podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please take care in listening. Investigator Shane Minor was on a road trip, driving from the city of Ogden toward a small town in southeastern Utah to talk with Cary Hartmann about the suspected murder of Sheree Warren. He's potentially a suspect, and you've not been able to interview him.
No.
It was October 26th, 2005. 20 years had passed since the evening when Sheree Warren disappeared.
Sheree went missing in 1985.
Shane had had the cold case since 1998. He had learned a lot about Cary Hartmann in those years.
But I didn't really know nothing about Sheree Warren.
I ran into this same problem when I started looking into this case. It's frustrating. There are so few people willing to share their memories of Sheree.
When I started looking into this, it was difficult just because of all the years that had gone past.
Some of the people I've reached out to have told me privately they won't talk on the record because they are afraid of Cary Hartmann. Shane Minor believed to crack the case, he would have to find Sheree Warren's remains. But experience told him Cary wasn't likely to give up that location if Cary had in fact killed Sheree. Shane and another detective had tried to question Cary about Sheree once before, in 1988, after Cary's rape conviction.
He wouldn't talk to us, walked in the room, see when we were sitting there, turned around, walked out.
Denial was Cary Hartmann's default. He had lied to his parents, siblings, children, friends, therapists, and others about his crimes. But he hadn't fooled a jury. Cary had continued the lies once incarcerated. He had even proclaimed his innocence in a letter to the President of the United States. But over time, the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole had pushed Cary to accept responsibility. By 2005, Cary had admitted to everything the board had asked him about, except any involvement in the disappearance of Sheree Warren 20 years earlier.
That's what he would admit to. He would never admit to anything else.
In the last episode, we heard how Shane had sent a letter to the parole board, letting them know Cary remained a suspect in Sheree's case. Cary had been on the verge of winning a release from custody then, but an officer for the board had put him on the spot.
Asked him some specific questions about Sheree Warren and how cooperative he was regarding that investigation.
Are you willing to talk to some of the law enforcement officials about her disappearance?
Well, absolutely. I had nothing to do with it.
Cary had had little other choice than to agree to a police interview if he wanted the parole board to grant him his freedom. So that's how Shane Minor ended up in the car, heading to the San Juan County Jail, where Cary was then being held. A Roy City police sergeant named Mike Elliott was riding shotgun.
Because Roy still had their active missing person case.
The jail's in a small town about an hour drive south of Arches National Park, as far from Ogden as one can get while still remaining within the borders of the state of Utah.
So we went down and interviewed him, recorded it.
Okay, I'm Shane Minor with Mike Elliott and Cary Hartmann. We're in Monticello, San Juan County Jail.
Had to go through Miranda, which he agreed to talk to us.
Right now, I'm going to give you rights because you don't have to talk to us unless you want to. So if you just listen to me for just a second, you have the right to remain silent.
The quality of this audio tape is really rough, so I'm going to repeat the most important bits where necessary. Before we dive in, though, we should talk about Shane's strategy.
I was about 100% sure that he wasn't going to say anything as far as admission goes.
Shane needed to put Cary Hartmann's story of Sheree's disappearance on the record. Otherwise, all Shane had were a few pages of Roy Police Detective Jack Bell's handwritten notes and a transcript of Cary's statement to his private investigator.
My memory of Hartman is if you confront him, he's going to get closed up and not answer your question. He's a smart person. He's very cautious and careful with what he says to you and how he says it. So I laid it out for him while we were down there, what we wanted to talk to him about, told him that I would ask him some questions.
I'm going to ask you some direct questions. Okay. Just because no one's asked you those questions.
Cary said he was willing to answer questions, to help any way he could, but first, he wanted to make a statement.
I
absolutely did not have anything to do with her disappearance.
Okay, I want to state that, right?
I just want to state that, right now, up front. Shane started by asking Cary if he remembered when it was Sheree first came up missing.
That's October 2nd or 3rd, 1985. Okay.
He thought it was October 2nd or 3rd of 1985.
Which is correct. Sheree disappeared the evening of the 2nd, and Sheree's mom reported her missing on the 3rd. Shane asked Cary what had been going on that week.
What had been going on that week? I can't remember anything significant.
And he could tell you about that day, but then the next day or the day after, he can't tell you anything.
I just can't remember.
He seems to remember what he wants to remember in the moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. He's not the first person I've encountered in my work who acts that way. That's a Josh Powell-esque move,
Yeah.
if I could say so. Right? This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 8, Fool Me Once. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. Investigator Shane Minor sat with Cary Hartmann in Utah's San Juan County Jail, 20 years on from the disappearance of Cary's girlfriend, Sheree Warren.
No, we got along fantastic. It was fantastic. We were in love.
He laid out the fact how him and Sheree was madly in love. He'd been going out with her.
Never had a harsh word or a soft word between us, not one.
They never had harsh words.
Which isn't true, based on the report of the two women who had lived above Cary at the time Sheree disappeared. You heard their account in Episode 4.
Sheree had gone over to his apartment. It was the first part of October, and she was upset and crying and saying, "How can you do this to me?"
On the other hand, Cary said Sheree had traded plenty of harsh words with her estranged husband, Chuck Warren, prior to her disappearance. Cary repeated the story about Chuck going to the credit union where Sheree worked and threatening her over child support.
Did Sheree tell you anything about that or say anything to you about that? Yeah, she did. Said it scared her.
Hartman kept referring to Sheree's ex-husband and kind of like pointing the finger at him.
Shane had previously asked Sheree's former boss, co-workers, and even Chuck Warren himself about this story of Chuck threatening Sheree at work. Chuck confirmed the argument had happened.
He told me about an event where he went in, he was upset.
That encounter remained a major reason why police couldn't rule Chuck out as a suspect. It spoke to a possible motive for murder, Chuck's anger over Sheree's push for increased alimony and child support.
So she was dragging him to court or back into court again, and he was really upset.
Cary told Shane he heard Chuck had brought a handgun into the credit union branch.
He had a gun tucked in his waistband. And who's telling you this? Credit union manager.
If you couldn't make that out, Cary said he had heard about the gun from Sheree's boss, the credit union manager.
But when I talked to the people at the credit union, they didn't describe anything that unordinary.
I talked to Sheree's former boss myself, and she told me she doesn't remember seeing a gun.
Nobody corroborated that. Nobody verified that. That's coming from Hartman, but nobody else.
So did Chuck Warren confront his estranged wife Sheree with a gun, or was that an exaggeration planted by Cary Hartmann? Cary said Chuck Warren was a violent kind of person. Shane seized on that opportunity and asked what Cary thought might have happened to Sheree.
What do you think happened to him? I've asked myself that every day for the last...
I've asked myself that every day for the last 20 years.
I don't have a clue.
I don't have a clue.
Have any ideas? I don't have an idea. Not one.
I don't have an idea.
Not one.
Not one.
Who do you think is responsible? I don't have an idea in the whole world. I don't have a clue.
Cary had had plenty of time to think about it, 20 years, but said he had no thought about who might have killed Sheree. Shane honed in on the days leading up to Sheree's disappearance. He asked Cary if he and Sheree had had any arguments of their own that week.
But no fights, no arguments. Never had. Never had one.
Never had one. This again contradicted the two women who had lived above Cary at the time, who had reported hearing a loud argument between Cary and Sheree. They believed the argument had happened on or around the night she disappeared, but they weren't certain of the exact date.
At some point in time, they heard a loud pop or thud, and then everything went quiet.
Shane had ever so subtly provided Cary an opening, an opportunity to say that argument had happened on a different night. Had Cary taken that opportunity, he could have undercut testimony that placed Sheree at his apartment on the night of her disappearance. But he didn't. Shane asked about Sheree's schedule. Cary said she had spent most nights with him.
Spent a lot of time together, spent 4 to 5 times a week together, that she would stay at his house.
Weekends or during the week? Well,
She had spent the night with him the night before and left from his house to go to Salt Lake.
she stayed with me and then commuted back and forth to check on her young son all the time, like every day, before work and after work and stuff like that. And she slept over at my house a great deal.
She slept over at my house a great deal of the time.
Which is inconsistent with what her ex-husband had said, which is inconsistent with what the Sorensens not only told to me, but what they originally reported.
And her son Adam would stay at her parents' house. Yes.
But he was adamant that she was at his house the night before and the night before that probably.
Cary said Sheree had left straight for work from his place on the morning of her disappearance, departing around 5:30 a.m. That was a full 2.5 hours before she was supposed to be to work. This differed from what Cary had told Detective Jack Bell the day after Sheree disappeared. Back then, he had said Sheree left his place at 7.
We got up, she got dressed, and put her work clothes on, and he me kissed goodbye and says, I'm going to work, see you. And says, bye-bye. And then she went straight to work. I don't know. I believe she did. I think she went right straight to Salt Lake from my place.
Cary said, I think she went right straight to Salt Lake from my place. No mention of meeting her estranged husband, Chuck Warren, or exchanging custody of her son. Once again, this was different from what Cary had said in the past.
And I think that was a slip-up.
Because it contradicted what both Sheree's parents and Chuck Warren had told Shane.
According to Hartman, she spent the night with him the night before, but according to the Sorensens, she was at their house and left from their house and dropped off Adam to his father at the Denny's and went to work.
This discrepancy gets to the heart of our tale of two coats conundrum. Cary had been telling police since the early days of the investigation Sheree left his apartment that morning wearing his black parka. But police had later found a gray suede women's jacket in Cary's apartment. Sheree's mom thought Sheree had left her house the morning of her disappearance in that gray suede jacket. Two conflicting accounts about two different coats. If Sheree's remains were ever found with Cary's black parka, Cary would have to explain how she ended up in his coat. This could be why Cary insisted Sheree left his apartment that morning, not her parents' house, and went straight to Salt Lake City. He needed to establish he had seen Sheree off that morning in his black parka, because otherwise Sheree turning up with it would place Cary and Sheree together on the night of her disappearance. But this is one of those clues that only comes into focus when looking back, with hindsight.
And it was just one of them things that just kind of got overlooked.
Overlooked in 1985, but not here in 2005. Shane was making careful notes. Cary said he had gone to work himself, then returned home around 4 that afternoon to shower. He said he had then headed to his second job at the Nice Corporation call center, but his phone rang as he was walking out the door. It was Sheree.
She says, what you doing? And I said, well, I'm just headed to work. That's nice. Oh, okay. I said, how are you? Fine. How's your day? Good. I'm training this guy. She said, what are you going to do after work? And she meant after night. And I said, well, I was going to stop down to Sebastian's and have a drink with Dave.
He talked about going to Sebastian's to meet a friend.
Well, she said, you're going to stay down there drinking all night? I said, no. I'm going to have a drink with Dave and I'm coming.
Talked about how she was going to come to his house after work and wait for him to leave a bar and come home.
So to recap, Cary said Sheree had called him around 4:30 on the afternoon of her disappearance and told him she'd meet him at his place in Ogden later that night.
Instead of go to her parents' house like she normally would do. So that portion of what he's saying, it just didn't really make a lot of sense to me.
It didn't make sense because the women who had lived above Cary never mentioned Sheree having a key to their house. To the contrary, they had said Sheree would sometimes wait at the back door for Cary if he wasn't home when she had dropped by. Cary told Shane he had then gone to work at his second job before heading to the bar a bit after 9 p.m. to meet his friend, Dave Moore.
He knew I got off at 9, so he was waiting at Sebastian's when I got there.
He was waiting at Sebastian's when I got there.
It was a bar restaurant, but it was pretty nice.
We've already heard from Dave Moore in this podcast. He's the friend of Cary's who had served in the police reserve with him.
We went through the course together.
Dave previously told us Cary had stopped by his sewing machine repair shop just before 6, and they had gone to the bar then. Dave said they'd had a few drinks, then he had headed home.
I'm guessing 8-ish.
I'll remind you, we've gone through this timeline discrepancy a couple of times already, starting in episode 2. Cary's very first version of the story, provided the day after Sheree's disappearance, had originally aligned with what Dave described. But Cary had revised his story in the days and weeks that followed, shifting the time of his meeting with Dave at the bar until later in the evening. Dave's told us he and Cary left the bar. An hour before, Cary was telling Shane he had first arrived at 9.
No, 9 o'clock, that's definitely wrong.
The shift in Cary's story revolved around his second job. In the revised version, Cary said he had gone to work at the Nice Corporation call center from about 6 to 9 before meeting Dave at the bar.
He worked at Weber State during the day, and then he had the second job at the call center at Nice Corp, right?
And I didn't know that either.
Okay.
To be honest, well, if I did, I don't remember that.
Cary's time card from the Nice Corporation could settle this question, but I don't believe investigators ever obtained it, and the company has long since gone belly up. So this boils down to, who do you believe? Cary Hartman or Dave Moore? There's a 3-hour difference in their stories, which made this bit of what Cary had to say of great interest to Shane Minor.
And that's because I think that's that 3 or 4 hour window we're looking at.
The window of time just after Sheree Warren left her work in Salt Lake City and disappeared. Let's set aside Dave Moore's account for the moment and remain focused on the version of events Cary was providing. Cary said he had told Dave he couldn't stay at the bar long because Sheree would already be waiting for him at home.
Okay, so well, why don't you call her and have her come down here?
In this scenario, Sheree is just sitting alone in Cary's basement apartment, twiddling her thumbs. Cary said David suggested he call Sheree and instead invite her to join them at the bar.
It rang 4 or 5 times.
Cary said he had dialed his home number. It rang several times with no answer, so he went back and told Dave something's wrong. Cary said it was Dave's idea for him to then call Sheree's mom.
I called Miss Sorensen, and I said, "Was Sheree there?" She said, "No, I thought she was with you."
By Cary's timeline, his first call to Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, would have happened after 10 p.m. But this contradicted what Mary had herself told police. She had said Cary had first called her around 8. So again,
His timing's kind of off on that little bit that didn't make sense.
Shane asked what Cary had done the next day. Cary said he'd gone to work, but he couldn't remember having any specific conversations with anyone.
No, I can't remember one person.
He talked about how he called Roy PD, he called the parents once.
Cary said he had made the call to Roy Police around noon, within earshot of his boss and a coworker. But Cary's time card showed he'd taken that day off work, and neither the boss nor the coworker had mentioned overhearing that phone call when they were each interviewed by police after Cary's arrest in 1987. And what's more, Detective Jack Bell's notes from the day after Sheree disappeared say he called Cary, not the other way around. More inconsistencies.
I wanted to confront him about those, but my concern at that time was he's just going to shut up. He's not going to say anything.
Shane hoped he might someday get a chance to interrogate Cary a second time, perhaps once he had secured an arrest warrant.
So I was hoping to be able to go back and say, well, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this.
Again, this was a matter of strategy. Shane was a spider spinning a web. He didn't intend to use venom until the time was right. Shane asked what Cary had done the weekend after Sheree disappeared. Cary said he had picked up his sons from his ex-wife that Saturday.
Do you remember anything else about that week? I don't. No.
No mention of going on a 3-wheeler ride with his TV reporter buddy, Larry Lewis, or of going up on the mountain behind Causey Reservoir with another man, possibly Cary's younger brother Jack Hartman, as the elk hunting guide Fred Johns had reported.
So some things he could remember, but then when you start talking about specifics, it's kind of like missing information.
These aren't just small gaps. Cary said he couldn't remember anything significant happening between Sheree's disappearance and his arrest a year and a half later.
Then it would divert to, well, that next year and a half was just a blur.
Next year and a half's a blur.
No mention of Sheree's car turning up in Las Vegas or the psychic letters. Nothing about talking to the two women who had lived above him, Kaylin and Mary. Roy Police Sergeant Mike Elliott hadn't said much so far in this interview, but he mused aloud about whether Cary would have discussed Sheree's disappearance with his upstairs housemates.
Maybe they saw him come that night and left. Maybe something you might ask. I didn't even consider it.
I'll remind you, police had found the note Mary had described taping to Cary's door. It proved he had in fact talked to his landlady and the upstairs renter after Sheree disappeared. Now, he told Shane Minor he hadn't, or at least couldn't remember it. It seemed all Cary could remember was one time Sheree had made him fried chicken for a picnic at Lost Creek Reservoir.
I said, let's go buy some chicken. And she said, no, let's make it.
Cary said, the chicken was so good.
It was so good.
As if he could still taste it. At least that memory seemed vivid. Shane decided to cut to the chase. He had a series of questions to ask.
And like I said, it's just a simple yes or no.
Then when it got down to questions, it was,
You know who's responsible for Sheree's disappearance or death?
Tough to hear, but Cary said no.
Did you have anything to do with Sheree's disappearance?
did you do anything to her? Everything was no.
Did you kill Sheree? No. You know where Sheree is now. Everyone.
Had no responsibility, nothing to do with her disappearing, has no idea what happened to her, had no idea where she's at.
Shane finished off the questions by asking about two specific locations, Lost Creek.
You know if Sheree was placed in the area of Lost Creek? I don't have a clue.
And Cawley.
You know if she was placed in an area of Cawley Estates? No, I don't have any idea.
Cary trailed off there, but he said, no, I don't have any idea. Shane told Cary the reason he had asked those questions is because he had talked to witnesses who put Cary and Sheree together on the night of her disappearance after she left the credit union office in Salt Lake City.
That's absolutely incredibly false. Ain't no way on this planet. That is a lie.
Denied her coming over to his house.
Cary's exact words were, ain't no way on this planet, that's a lie. He insisted the bar had been packed full of people who had all seen him there that night. But Shane knew no one had ever come forward to verify that. And after 20 years, no one ever could.
Time has really compounded figuring some things out.
On the other hand, Shane told Cary multiple inmates who had served time with him had come forward over the years to say Cary killed Sheree Warren.
That's bullshit. That's an inmate with a grudge.
Cary said that's bullshit. That's an inmate with a grudge.
Do you know who that would be? I don't have a clue.
Cary didn't have a clue who might have held a grudge against him. He didn't mention Nathaniel Bell, the inmate who had punched him unconscious during a game of handball and who Cary had then testified against in court. He didn't name William Babel or David Westmoreland, who had both snitched on him, even if less than credibly. If Cary had said Babel or Westmoreland hated him for some reason, it might have served to discredit what they had told police and the FBI. But Cary didn't mention them. Cary said any prisoner who claimed he had made incriminating comments about Sheree Warren was a liar.
I just want to be absolutely clear on that fact. No way on this earth did I kill anyone that I was involved because I'm not.
Shane pivoted, asking Cary if he'd been a hunter when Sheree disappeared.
Did you do any hunting that year? I think I did.
Cary said he'd gone out every deer season, which in Utah started the third week of October. But Shane wanted to know about an earlier date, during elk season, the Sunday after Sheree disappeared.
Were you in the area of Cawley Estates up above? Cawley Estates the weekend after? Never. Absolutely not.
He denied basically that.
Cary insisted he had never gone into Cawley Estates except with his friend Dave Moore.
I never, ever in my life went to Cawley that I didn't go through the gate that Dave didn't open. Never.
Cary said he, Dave Moore, and another of their friends, a former Ogden cop named Bill Thorstead, used to rip around Cawley Estates on their three-wheelers during the winter. Dave Moore and Bill Thorstead both owned lots in Cawley Estates. Cary had visited both of them. Shane knew another of Cary's old friends, the taxidermist Brent Morgan, also had a cabin up in Cawley Estates.
In the early years, the advantage was it was very isolated.
Brent's the guy who had his wedding on that mountain a year before Sheree disappeared.
So you're holding that event up there. One of your guests is Cary Hartmann.
That is correct.
Which means Cary's assertion he had only ever gone into Cawley Estates when Dave Moore let him through the gate was not true. Brent told me Cary had been into Cawley Estates multiple times without Dave Moore.
Well, when we were doing our cabin, guess who did the plumbing work? Cary did. Now, he wasn't up on top like when I got married, but he knew the gate system. He knew how to get to my place. He could drive the roads. If he left my cabin and he wanted to go to the top of Skullcrack, he could drive up there.
We don't have to just take Brent at his word on this. I have a copy of a daily journal Cary kept during 1984, the year before Sheree disappeared. It contains notes in Cary's own handwriting about Brent owing him money for the work he did on Brent's cabin. It's documentary evidence what Cary told Shane about never going into Cawley Estates without his friend Dave Moore was not true.
He said he really didn't have access to it, but we'd been told he had a key to it.
You might remember from earlier episodes, Brent the taxidermist loaned Cary a key to the gate at Cawley Estates during the fall of '85.
That is correct.
Shane asked Cary about this.
Did you ever have a key? And I was all, no, never. Did you borrow a key? Never.
So you've got him staunchly denying what your witness is telling you. And those are two things that can't be reconciled.
Right.
The inconsistencies were stacking up.
Asked him if he'd ever been up on top hunting. He said he hadn't.
Cary said he had never hunted the Cawley side of the mountain, only the Lost Creek side.
Well, I hunted at Lost Creek. I never hunted at Cawley, never.
I've described Cawley, Lost Creek, and the mountain between them as looking like a percent sign. Cawley is the circle in the upper left, Lost Creek's the circle in the lower right, the mountain is the diagonal slash between them. There's a dirt road that goes south from Cawley, up the mountain to the bottom of the slash. That's where the cabins of Cawley Estates are. The road then turns, going up and to the right along the mountaintop, following the slash before dropping down to Lost Creek. It's on that road where the elk hunting guide Fred Johns reported seeing Cary 4 days after Sheree disappeared. Shane knew Cary had the borrowed key for the Cawley side. He wanted to know if Cary also had access from the Lost Creek side. I read aloud from a transcript of Shane's interview with Cary when we sat down to talk, repeating what Cary had said about hunting at Lost Creek after Sheree disappeared.
I hunted with my brother.
I hunted with my brother. We all put our truck and campsite right there in the cul-de-sac, people all over the place. And then you said, which cul-de-sac?
Which cul-de-sac? I'm not right, but by the boat ramp.
By the boat ramp. There's only one. You get on the road, there's only one that's paved. That's the only one I know of. Where is it? By the boat ramp at Lost Creek, yeah.
At Lost Creek, yeah.
Cary saying he had hunted around Lost Creek with his younger brother Jack Hartman after Sheree disappeared also seemed to line up with what Shane had heard from the elk hunting guide Fred Johns. Fred had reported seeing another man with Cary on the mountain behind Cawley. Fred told police he thought the second man was Jack Hartman. Shane asked Cary if he'd be willing to take a new type of lie detector test called a voice stress analyzer. Cary seemed cautious and asked, "How accurate is it?" Shane said he wasn't sure. He just wanted to use it to eliminate Cary as a suspect. At this, Cary balked. He said he didn't understand how Sheree disappearing from Salt Lake while he was 40 miles away in Ogden didn't already do that.
You gotta see my position. I understand your position. I mean, I'm dubious as hell about it. I did or whatever, thinking, oh, man, what do I have to do?
Cary said, "I'm dubious as hell about this," thinking, oh man, what do I have to do? He decided, nah, he wasn't going to take a lie detector test. So Shane wrapped up the interview. He packed away his notes and tape recorder. He hadn't expected a confession, and he hadn't got one.
But at the same time, he's giving you some information he doesn't realize he's given to you.
For example, Shane had confirmed Cary had hunted the mountains around Lost Creek Reservoir with his brother Jack after Sheree disappeared. And Jack Hartman had never been questioned about the disappearance of Sheree Warren. So that's where Shane Minor headed next. Weber County investigator Shane Minor had finally, after 20 years, questioned Cary Hartman about the disappearance of Sheree Warren.
And I was just trying to get as much information as we could from him.
Cary had denied any involvement, but he'd also made several statements contradicting what other witnesses had said over the years. Most importantly, he had denied having gone up the mountain behind Cawley Reservoir the weekend after Sheree vanished.
I don't think I asked him about a conversation he had with Fred Johns up on top.
Shane's memory is right. He hadn't revealed to Cary the elk hunting guide Fred Johns had seen Cary and another man parked on a mountain ridge behind Cawley just 4 days after Sheree vanished.
I think he would have clammed up.
Fred had said he had thought the other man was Cary's brother, Jack Hartman.
We didn't have contact with the brother during that period of time of the rape cases.
Roy Police Detective Jack Bell had once tried to interview Jack Hartman in May of 1987.
I never really got to talk to Jack on the record in the office.
Jack Bell's notes say Jack Hartman had canceled their appointment after talking to Cary's defense attorney. When Shane Minor had taken over the Sheree Warren case a decade later, he'd learned Cary's family had never been questioned.
So that information was that his brother and all of his family was told not to talk to us by his attorney. So having that in mind, you think, well, they're gonna resist talking to you, so let's avoid that.
Shane met with a seasoned criminal prosecutor named Bill Daines. They brainstormed a plan.
It was probably his suggestion. Well, we'll just do this. We'll compel him, put him under oath, and compel him by subpoena.
Under Utah law, prosecutors can ask a judge for subpoena power. If the judge approves, the prosecutor can force witnesses to testify under oath at a secret hearing.
And then offer transactional immunity, some type of agreement if that comes into play.
Investigators could have tried this tactic early on, after Cary's arrest in the rape case in 1987. I'm not sure why they didn't. It was a major missed opportunity.
Looking back, we're going off of the information that we have.
What I'm going to tell you next has never before been publicly revealed because of the secret nature of these types of subpoenas. Shane Minor personally served Cary Hartman's brother, Jack Hartman, with an investigative subpoena in January of 2006. Shane told me Jack had seemed surprised.
I think his attitude was like, what's this all about? Just ask me.
The subpoena ordered Jack Hartman to appear for questioning at the Weber County offices. Jack did as ordered and met prosecutor Bill Daines.
The individual who is presently in the courtroom and who was just sworn in, his name is Jack Hartman. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
The existence of this audio recording has been a secret for more than 15 years.
This is a secret proceeding, and so you are asked not to divulge the contents of this proceeding to anyone other than a lawyer that you might want to talk to. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
Bill told Jack anything he said might be used against him, but
we do not view you as a target.
A target of what? A murder investigation.
And what I will tell you is, although I'm assuming you've already guessed this, is that this involves the disappearance on October 2nd, 1985, of a young woman by the name of Sheree Warren, and the fact that she has never subsequently been found.
Bill explained police had gathered a great deal of information over the past 20 years. Most of it had never been made public. That information pointed to a suspect, Jack's older brother, Cary.
Did Cary ever talk to you about his relationship with Sheree Warren?
No.
He did not?
No.
Bill worked through the questions he had drafted with investigator Shane Minor, while Shane and Roy Police Captain Jack Bell sat in the back of the room, listening.
We asked him questions about his relationship with his brother, and I think he was quite open with us. I think he was honest with us about it.
You are his younger brother.
Correct.
How much younger than Cary are you?
8 years.
All right. And were you close growing up?
No.
In our first episode, I told you how Cary and his second wife had gone to Oceanside, California with another woman, Jack Hartman's fiancée, in the summer of 1980. Cary's ex-wife later told police Cary had tried to rape Jack's fiancée after they had arrived. Bill asked Jack about that story.
He had attempted to rape your wife?
He attempted or did, and I'm not sure. My wife held information from me.
Jack said he'd only learned what had happened on that day in California 7 years later, in 1987, after Cary's arrest. Another instance of people not coming forward for fear of Cary.
You've had problems with your brother, Cary, at least as of 1987.
Oh, yes.
But why had Jack Hartman not shared that information about his brother with police at the time?
Do you remember if Kevin Sullivan, as your brother's attorney, ever advised you not to talk to the police?
He might have.
He might have told you don't talk to the police about anything?
Something, I don't know.
All right.
Maybe I don't know, maybe I'd speak honestly and he didn't want to hear it. I don't know.
So Jack and Cary's relationship had been on the rocks since at least 87. What about before that, when Sheree Warren had disappeared?
Did you have good relationship with your brother at that time?
No.
You did not?
No.
Why was it at that time that you weren't seeing him very
Well, it was
often?
even prior to that. Him and I just, he changed. He was like two people. He would disrupt family gatherings terribly. And at one time I caught him, making obscene gestures towards my girlfriend at the time, which became my wife. That really irritated me. It was either do what I ask you or do it when I ask you, or you're a SOB. And I didn't like the life. We would argue at get-togethers where everything's supposed to be great. It had turned into a fight. I got sick of it. So that was years before. So our relationship never was great.
All right.
Especially at this time, we were seeing each other very seldom at best.
Seldom, but not never. Bill showed Jack one of the missing persons flyers Cary had printed in October of 85, shortly after Sheree disappeared. The same style flyer that still hung in a display case in the lobby of Roy City Police headquarters.
I remember these. My brother had us helping him pass them out. I remember that story.
You're saying that Cary told you nothing about this disappearance at the time?
No, I'm sure he didn't. I can't remember him ever coming and saying, look, so-and-so's gone. I don't know. He did say that, I remember, because then he started this poster flyer.
And that's
thing.
number 2.
So,
what I have marked number 2 is the poster you're referring to.
Yeah.
He was responsible for creating these insofar as you know.
As far as I know.
Bill pivoted.
Do you know if your brother liked to go to Las Vegas?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like I told you, our relationship was very sketchy at best. So a lot of his life I didn't know about. I don't know that for sure. I know he never went to Wendover that I know of, and that's a gambling place, which is similar that I know of.
All right.
So I don't know.
Did you ever go to Las Vegas with Cary?
No.
Bill described Sheree's car, the maroon 1984 Toyota Corolla that had turned up behind the Aladdin Casino in Vegas several weeks after Sheree disappeared.
Did you ever hear Cary speculate as to how Sheree's car might have ended up in the city of Las Vegas?
No.
Did he ever tell you that he had driven that car to Las Vegas or anything of that nature?
No.
Did you ever, in the days after Sheree Warren disappeared, pick your brother up at the Salt Lake airport?
No, sir.
Bill also showed Jack a photo of Cary's old truck, a Chevy pickup from the 1970s with a shell over the bed.
Oh, I remember that truck, the yellow one. Okay, yeah, ugly, terrible yellow. Yep. Now I remember.
Bill didn't say it, but this was the truck Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had described seeing with Cary on the mountain behind Cawley.
This truck that I've shown you in number 3, you've agreed is an ugly yellow truck that Cary, in case I didn't record over there.
Yes.
Did you ever ride in this truck anywhere?
I'm sure I did.
Bill was laying foundation.
Do you hunt?
Yes.
As he worked toward a point.
Were you hunting in 1985?
I'm sure I was. I don't miss a year.
Seeking to put Cary on that mountain days after Sheree Warren disappeared.
Do you know if Cary had access to Cawley Estates?
I don't.
Jack said he had hunted the mountains around Cawley himself a time or two, but never with Cary. He said Cary's friend, Brent Morgan, the taxidermist, had once let him into Cawley Estates for a day.
Scratched the heck out of my truck, I remember that.
But Jack said he had done this on his own. Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had told police he had seen Cary and Jack Hartman together on the mountain behind Cawley Estates on the opening weekend of the annual elk hunt.
Did Cary hunt back in 1985?
Probably.
What did he hunt to the best of your present recollection? Just deer?
Just deer.
All right, you're not the first person who's told us that. You don't remember Cary hunting elk.
No.
Fred Johns had shown investigator Shane Minor the exact spot where he had remembered seeing Cary and Jack Hartman on the mountain. As I mentioned in the last episode, the land belonged to a sheep-herding family named the Wilds. Fred Johns paid the Wilds for the right to take his clients in pursuit of elk on their land, and Fred did not like trespassers.
Now, do you know of property above Cawley Estates known as Wilds property, and I believe that's a family name?
I've heard of it.
Have you ever been there?
No.
Are you certain?
Not that I know of. I know that I've always heard that it's good hunting in there, but I've never gone in there.
Bill talked Jack through the various ways one could reach the wild property. The two most important for us are through Cawley Estates or by way of Lost Creek Reservoir. Again, picture that percent sign. 2 circles separated by a slash. 2 reservoirs separated by a mountain, but connected by a rough dirt road running along the mountaintop. The wild property where Fred Johns had seen Cary and another man sat right in the middle of the slash in the percent sign, midway between the 2 reservoirs. Gates blocked the road at both sides. Cary had borrowed a key for the Cawley side, but what about the Lost Creek side?
Right at the back of Lost Creek, I think everybody who hunts elk knows, is the road into deseret land and livestock.
Yes.
The Lost Creek area was an area you were very familiar with.
Yes.
And as far as you know, Cary was very familiar with it.
Somewhat. Not like me.
Their conversation of the geography went into a lot more detail than we need to hear. But Jack had no confusion over where it was the elk hunting guide Fred Johns claimed to have seen Cary and Jack on the mountain.
Did you, within a few days after Sheree Warren disappeared, ever go elk hunting or deer hunting with your brother Cary?
I can't remember. I gotta say no.
Did Cary ever take you into the mountains within that period of time for any other reason that you can now think of?
No.
So what had Cary been doing up there, if Fred Johns was to be believed?
Do you know a person named Fred Johns?
Yes.
How do you know him?
Through my brother.
Jack said he had first met Fred in the mid-70s. This was probably around the time Cary had briefly lived with Fred, while Cary was between his 2 marriages. Jack remembered having gone into the mountains with Cary and Fred a time or 2 back then, but that had been years before Sheree Warren disappeared.
Would, in 1985, Fred Johns have known what you look like?
I'm sure. I'm pretty sure.
Bill turned to the critical question.
He indicates that on that day, you and Cary were on his leased land, backed into those trees in this truck. Is that true?
This is in 85.
This would have been 4 days after Sheree's disappearance.
I can't remember, but I guess it's possible.
It wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes either.
Do you remember coming across Fred Johns one day asking you what you were doing on his land?
I don't remember that.
Could you have been up there on that date?
I'll say I could have, because I can't remember for sure.
Investigator Shane Minor was still watching from the back of the room, his detective senses alert, listening for any lie.
I think he gave some pretty honest answers. He couldn't recall he'd been up there, but he couldn't remember what date it was.
Could you have been approached by Fred Johns and asked, what are you doing here?
I guess, but I can't remember that, to be perfectly honest.
Bill, the prosecutor, didn't leave any room for ambiguity.
Did you ever help Cary put anything in a canyon up on that ridge?
No.
But when we asked him specifics about dropping anything or that first week, he's like, no, I wasn't me.
Did he ever tell you of any problems he was having with Sheree Warren?
No.
Do you by any means whatsoever have any idea where Sheree is?
No.
Has anybody told you where she might be?
No.
Has Cary ever mentioned this to you?
No.
At all?
No, sir.
I think I was hoping that he would give us that one little piece that we didn't have. And when we got done, there was just nothing.
Shane had figured Cary Hartmann wasn't going to confess if he had killed Sheree Warren. But Shane had hoped Cary's accomplice, if he had had one, might feel the sting of guilty conscience. Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had told Shane Cary's little brother Jack Hartman could have been that accomplice. Shane had pinned all his remaining hopes of finding Sheree Warren on reaching a breakthrough with Jack. Jack Hartman was the last, best lead Shane had.
All right. I don't have any further questions at this time. Mr. Hartman, you're free to go.
Shane interjected in an act of near desperation, trying to keep the conversation going, asking if Jack had any questions he'd like to ask them.
I do have one.
All right.
Why now? I'm just curious, has my brother, because all I did is read about this in the paper, and it was like, holy moly.
Well,
so then I'm wondering why 18 years later, has he said something,
Well, and here
We're
again,
just curious.
what I'm telling you is that some of the information we have may not have been 18 years old. That's why I informed you straight out in the beginning. We may have information over the years, but when you're saying why now, that's why.
Yeah,
we have evidence here. Obviously, I just asked you a series of questions.
Right.
That we have information about.
They stopped the recording, but Jack stayed a little while to talk off the record with Bill Daines and Shane Minor. Their conversation only reinforced Shane's gut feeling, his belief Jack had told them the truth. He hadn't helped his brother Cary conceal the suspected murder of Sheree Warren.
I just didn't get that drift that he was involved with him and really wanted anything to do with him.
But Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had said he had seen a second man with Cary Hartman on the mountain behind Cawley.
And he thought it was his brother.
So if that second man wasn't Jack Hartman, who was it?
Bill and I talked about it after. We all felt the same way about him, and just like, it wasn't him. I don't think he was with him. It had to have been somebody else.
Someone else who resembled Cary and Jack Hartman.
I know Cary had a cousin that looked a lot like him that was used in the lineups from the rape cases.
When Cary had stood in that police lineup in May of 1987, he had brought his brother Jack and cousin David with him. Back in episode 5, we heard how the woman I called Caroline had tried to pick Cary out of the lineup. But Cary and his cousin David had looked so similar, Caroline couldn't tell them apart. So I wonder, could the second man on the mountain with Cary have been David Hartman? Would the resemblance of Cary's cousin have been enough to confuse Fred Johns? It's a question I'll never be able to answer because Fred Johns is dead, and so is David Hartman. David died in 2004. He was never interviewed by investigators. His life after Cary's arrest was marred by alcoholism. Court records show David was repeatedly convicted for driving under the influence. He'd been married twice, and I've talked to his second ex-wife, who only met him years after Cary went to prison. She told me David wasn't an outdoorsman, and to her knowledge never visited Cawley Reservoir. She could only remember David mentioning Cary one time in reference to having helped him at the police lineup. David Hartman's obituary said his love for his family was, quote, surpassed by nothing on this earth. Jack Hartman hadn't provided answers that brought investigator Shane Minor any closer to finding the remains of Sheree Warren.
And so it was just like getting the wind kicked out of you. It's like you're just, now what? Where do you go from here?
Shane had spent more than 6 years grinding out a case, building a better record, hoping along the way to find Sheree Warren's remains. He had done the work when no one else would. Not because he had some deep emotional connection with Sheree, but because his sense of justice demanded it. He had dragged cadaver dogs up the mountain, squeezed his broad frame into a small helicopter, and hovered over the spot where he believed Cary Hartmann might have dumped Sheree's body. But in the end, all that effort left him right back where he had started. He felt like he had missed something. One critical piece.
Trying to get somebody to remember something, or someone we hadn't talked to, maybe point us in a direction.
Now, Shane was rudderless. He had loose ends, not leads. He hadn't been able to find Shauna, the woman Cary had dated and married after Sheree disappeared. Maybe she harbored information. I'll note, I've reached out to Shauna myself, but she didn't respond to my message. Shane wondered about William Babel, aka Charlie, the FBI informant. He's the snitch we heard about in episode 6, who had been in Cary's sex offender therapy group and who claimed Cary had been infatuated with Ted Bundy.
Thought about trying to get back and go with that Babel, but he had died.
Shane had hit one too many dead ends. He had sacrificed so many of his own nights, on his own time, chasing answers. He just couldn't do it anymore.
I didn't want to give up on it, but at the same time, it's like, there's got to be that one thing that somebody knows something. Maybe they just don't know what they know.
Vultures smelled Shane's desperation. A group of self-described clairvoyants swooped in, offering to work the Sheree Warren case on his behalf. Having no better options, Shane was willing to entertain it. The clairvoyants held viewing sessions, then sent Shane emails full of vague, nonsensical notes. Stuff like, water or the smell of wet earth. I can hear crickets. I feel that night is important. Yeah, try planning a search off that and let me know how it goes. The clairvoyants even enlisted the help of a California woman named Ann Golomak, who had made a name for herself as a ghost hunter on cable TV shows in the early 2000s.
To put it frankly, Ann claims she sees dead people.
I may see them very clearly, and I will then ask them what they need, or if they have a story to tell, or if they need help.
Golomak performed her own psychic reading, and in notes I've obtained, claimed to have herself talked to Sheree's spirit. Golomak said she saw a 14-year-old girl with a connection to New Jersey. I am being shown a doll as I talk to Sheree, Golomak wrote. This is all bogus, and the fact it even ended up in investigator Shane Minor's case file shows just how desperate he had become.
Well, you keep thinking that you're going to find something that you missed, and it's going to point to something. And
if it was easy, it wouldn't be a cold case.
No. Yeah. Yep. And if the person that done it's not talking and was careful not to say too much, then it just makes it that much harder.
Meanwhile, other cases landed on Shane's desk. One of those involved a new lead in the search for another missing woman, Joyce Yost. You can hear about Shane's work on that case in Season 2 of this podcast. In another case, Shane ended up searching for the body of a teenage girl who had disappeared from the home of a couple who had hired her as a babysitter.
At first, police believed that 16-year-old Alexis Rasmussen could have been a runaway. Rasmussen never came home after she left to babysit for Eric and Dia Millerberg September 11th.
The girl, Alexis Rasmussen, was missing 5 weeks before a prison informant broke the case open. The informant provided police with the name of a witness who had helped the killer bury Alexis off the side of Interstate 84.
Prosecutors say Eric Millerberg gave the drugs to Alexis Rasmussen. When she died, he and his wife Dia moved the teen's body to Morgan County, where investigators would find it 5 weeks later.
The Alexis Rasmussen case demanded years of Shane's attention, dragging him away from the search for Sheree Warren.
The discovery changed the course of the investigation, which began as a missing persons case.
The parallels between Sheree Warren's disappearance and the murder of Alexis Rasmussen struck me. Both were first reported as missing persons. Both involved jailhouse informants who claimed the victims were buried off the side of the interstate. Both scenarios included a suspect possibly soliciting help to hide the victim's body in the mountains. In one case, Shane had been able to help secure an arrest, conviction, and the return of the victim's body. In the other, well...
it just kind of takes another back seat.
Newer crimes always seem to take priority over old ones.
Got to be very demanding in time, so I just didn't get back to it.
No one stepped forward to pick up where he had left off. The search for Sheree Warren once again went cold. Cary Hartmann once again went before the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole in September of 2010.
All right, Mr. Hartman, I'm going to take testimony today, so I'd like you to raise your right hand so I can swear you in.
That's the voice of Parole Board Hearing Officer Dwayne Kaneko. We've already heard 4 of Cary Hartmann's prior hearings before the Parole Board in this podcast. But notice in this one how much better Cary had grown at telling the board what it wanted to hear.
Tell me why the board should let you out.
I've changed my thinking and I've changed my life.
It had been 5 years since Cary's interview with Shane Minor. 25 years since Sheree Warren disappeared.
At this point, I guess my question is, tell me how many victims you've had.
I have 4 charged and 5 uncharged.
So 9 total?
Yes, sir.
Cary claimed 5 sexual assaults for which he had never faced criminal charges.
3 of those were my ex-wives, sir.
Okay.
That was sexual abuse. I was married 3 times. 2 of them not very long, they were very short, and one of them I was married for 5 years. And it wasn't an ongoing basis, it happened on occasion.
Mm-hmm.
One was a date, it was an attempted rape.
Ogden police had in 1987 collected multiple reports from women who had said Cary had assaulted them. Those never resulted in criminal charges, but there were more than one, and the conduct they described went beyond attempted.
And the 5th was a 10-year-old girl when I was 14 years old. I sexually abused her.
Let that sink in. Cary admitted he had sexually abused a 10-year-old girl when he was himself just 14. This obliterated the idea Heidi Posnine, who Cary had tried to lure up to a remote mountain campground when he was 22, was his first victim. It undercut the idea his experience in Vietnam or later financial troubles were the root of his behavior. In episode 5, we heard how Cary told a therapist when he first entered sex offender treatment he had learned about sex at age 15 from some kids at school. This admission contradicted that.
And there's been no one else?
No, sir.
No mention of Sheree Warren. Over the course of this season, you've heard Cary Hartmann go from making outright denials to partial admissions to this supposedly full confession of his crimes.
Because I wasn't clear-headed, because I was deviant in my thinking, I sought out pornography and masturbation, and deviancy was what I delved in, and I didn't think clearly, and I wasn't using clear thinking at the time.
I've come to think of this as Cary's progression of accountability. He only ever admitted to what he had to, denying everything else. As a result, he had made many contradictory claims while under oath over the years. He had proven himself untrustworthy, leaving one to wonder if this version of his story represented the entire truth.
I didn't have empathy for people at that time. I didn't consider people's feelings. I was selfish and self-centered. I wanted instant sexual gratification.
Cary touched on a significant idea with this statement.
Are these things that you had fantasized about previously?
Yes, sir.
There is a growing body of academic research surrounding the psychology of rape and sexual assault. Much of it seeks to answer the question, what drives some men to commit rape?
And then so you figured because of that it was okay?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And it didn't matter what they thought?
No, sir, it didn't at the time.
Cary said he had just wanted instant sexual gratification. But that's probably an oversimplification, because rape isn't just rooted in the rapist's physical desires.
I've learned to control my emotions and my impulses.
The origins often touch on the rapist's own narcissism, lack of empathy, hostility toward women, or desire to dominate another human being.
I've learned to counter the things that drive me, which are objectifying women and my red flags and triggers.
Cary said he'd unraveled all his issues, this deep-seated psychological stuff, in therapy over the space of a few short years. He was all better now.
I can go out and be a happy person, deviant-free and not a harm to anyone.
The parole board hearing officer, Dwayne Kaneko, didn't ask Cary about Sheree Warren. He could have, if he had wanted. But the parole board's job wasn't solving crimes. Without an investigator pushing the board to ask, as Shane Minor had done 5 years earlier, it had little reason to intervene. Cary had minded his manners in the time since. He had done everything the board had asked of him. As a result, he was on track for a release from custody. Kaneko said he just wanted a little more assurance Cary wasn't a threat to reoffend before taking that major step. But Kaneko said if Cary kept playing by the rules, release could be just a year or two away.
What do you think will be the biggest thing that you'll have to contend with?
Staying in contact with my support group. Always being open and honest. Being truthful in every single thing that I do.
But he looked forward to seeing how the world had changed in the more than 2 decades since his arrest, conviction, and incarceration.
Imagine technology's changed just a little bit.
Just a little.
One can imagine what might have happened if Cary had had access to a smartphone back in the days of his lingerie survey phone calls.
I no longer have any desire whatsoever to be involved in anything like that.
The parole board had to decide. Had Cary Hartmann really changed?
Tell me what you think is going through the minds of your victims.
I believe they were scared to death. I believe that they feared for their lives. I believe that they probably will feel fear in many, many areas of their lives for the rest of their lives.
A fear that might well grow if the board decided to set Cary free. Coming up on the next episode of Cold.
Can you tell us what changed your plans? Why didn't you go to Wagstaff? Do you remember that?
I don't know. I just never made it down there.
You never made it down there?
Yeah.
If you have information about the disappearance of Sheree Warren, now is the time to share it. You can reach me by emailing cold@ksl.com or contact the Roy City Police Department at 801-774-1063. I also want you to know, if you've experienced abuse or sexual violence, you're not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Cold is researched, written, and hosted by me, Dave Cawley. Audio production and sound design by Ben Kuebrich and Aaron Mason. Mixing and mastering by Ben Kuebrich. Michael Bahnmiller composed our main theme, with additional music this season by Allison Leyton-Brown. My personal thanks to our editorial team, Amy Donaldson, Andrea Smarden, Ryan Meeks, Becky Bruce, Kira Faramond, Kellyanne Halverson, Josh Tilton, and Felix Bennell. For Amazon Music and Wondery, managing producer Candice Manriquez-Wren, producer Claire Chambers, senior producer Lizzie Bassett, and executive producer Morgan Jones. Special thanks to Cale Bittner and Allison Vermeulen. With Workhouse Media executive producers Paul Anderson and Nick Panella. And for KSL Podcasts, executive producer Sheryl Worsley. For pictures and more, go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and follow us on social @thecoldpodcast. Most of all, thank you for listening.